An interesting nuance in the laws of an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, teaches us how Hashem is with us in Golus, and Golus is not overwhelmingly real. In Heintige Seder Zokti Torah, our parasha tells us, if a Jewish person was sold as an Eved to another Jewish person, if the Yovel 50th year comes around, then he leaves his owner together with his children. So Rashi picks up on those words, he and his sons with him. On his Mefarish, explains as follows. Rabbi Shimon, which is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, explains, if he was sold as a slave, Bonav mi mochron, who sold his children into slavery as well. And rather from here we learn that the master over the slave is required to provide food for his children. So we need to understand what's going on over here. The shaila in Pasuk is doch blois Bonav mi mochron. We understand Rashi's question. Who sold the children into slavery? So why does Rashi have to give us this whole intro? If he had been sold, which makes a lot of sense, who sold his children? Even though you could say, well, because Rashi is quoting Rabbi Shimon, and that's how Rabbi Shimon said it. The Rebbe has clarified for us numerous times, it is not Rashi's way of doing things when he comments on the Torah, to specifically quote the teachings of our sages verbatim. On their far is often more mashana or pshita mashpat or makatsa. So very often Rashi changes. Sometimes he leaves out things that they said from Lashon Razal from the original. Because he wants to convey the meaning of the pasuk according to pshat. So the fact that Rabbi Shimon said it that way is not good enough reason why Rashi specifically said it too. Now this question is in dem is noch starker. The question is magnified when you have a look at elsewhere where Rashi has spoken about the same topic, which is in the parasha for Eved Ivri in Parashas Mishpatim, right at the beginning when we were first introduced to the idea of a Jewish slave, which is in Parashas Mishpatim. There state the Torah tells us in Ba'ali Shohu, if the person who became an Eved Ivri was married, his wife leaves the slavery with him as well, similar to what we're saying over here, that his children leave with him. Rashi's Mefarish, there Rashi explains as follows. His wife leaves with him, who took her in as a slave that she has to now go free. From there we learn that the person who acquires an Eved Ivri is required to provide food for his wife as well. There you go, Rashi's talking the same language apparently as he does over here. So there you see, as Rashi the only thing is there Rashi doesn't say, if he was sold, who sold his wife? Now, he goes straight to the question about the wife. Who brought her into the world of slavery? In unser Seder is a yemaktimim imkar. So if it was good enough in the context of why is the wife a slave, just to get straight to the question, why is it not good enough in our parasha that he first has to say, if he was sold, who sold his children? The question is even further magnified. The pele is noch größer. The marker for Maimir Rabbi Shimon was Rashi bring Befasha Seinu is in Gemara. Rashi is quoting Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon appears in the Gemara in Kiddushin. And dort bringt sich as Rabbi Shimon hat euch gedashne Pasuk von Mishpatim. And where the Gemara quotes Rabbi Shimon, it also quotes him about Parshas Mishpatim with regards to the wife. V'yatza ishta imoi in demselben Signon. And there Rabbi Shimon actually says it in the same style. In other words, Rabbi Shimon, im hu nimkar, same words. If he had been sold as a slave, which is obvious, ishta min nimkara, who sold his wife as a slave. From here we learn that the master is required to provide food, sustenance to the wife as well. So Rashi is quoting the same Gemara, but in Parshas Mishpatim he does not use the words of Rabbi Shimon, and here in Parshas Behar he does. No, it brings from Mechilta. In fact, over there in Mishpatim it sounds like Rashi is actually speaking the language of the Mechilta, which is who brought her in that she should have to go out. Doesn't even use those words that she was min nimkera. So there he doesn't quote Rabbi Shimon's language. Here he does. Why the difference? Why do we have to know im hu nimkar? Nochmer. Let's take it one step further. Even those words that Rashi says, who sold the sons, even that doesn't necessarily come across clearly. Because in Teras Kahanim, do brings the limit from Pasuk. Teras Kahanim on this week's parasha just goes straight to the lesson, which is Rabbi Chai bim Zenes Bonov, that the master is required to provide food for the children. Without asking the question, but how did they become slaves in the first place? Who sold them? Rashi is so Rashi, who normally follows the style of not to first give the question and then give the response. Not to Rashi's normal style is to cut to the chase and tell us what the pasuk is teaching. So here Rashi should have skipped the question, who made the children slaves, and just got straight to the point, which is the master has to provide for the children. Without raising the question in the first place. So our question about Rashi's style is, why is he bringing up information that we don't need? Well, here's a possible answer. There's a difference between how the Torah speaks in Mishpatim to how the Torah speaks in Behar. Maybe that's the reason Rashi makes this distinction. Maybe Rashi comes with different angles on his commentary because the psukim actually tell us the story differently. In unser pasuk state here in Behar it says, Hu uvanav imoy, right? V'yatza hu uvanav imoy. He and his sons together leave the slavery. That's what leads Rashi to say, well, if he, key word in the pasuk, was sold, who sold his children? Whereas in Pashas Mishpatim, there's no emphasis about the fact that he is going out, it's just that his wife goes with him. On them word who doesn't say that key word who. So Rashi also doesn't speak about the word who. He just gets straight to the question: how did she become a slave? Maybe that's the explanation. But there is klal nit maspik, says the Rebbe, that will not work. As we well know, Rashi's commentary is absolutely precise and as concise as possible. Rashi doesn't say things to sound poetic or because he wants to link the words in his pirush to the words in the pasuk. If he says something in a particular way, it's because that's how it has to be. So, when Rashi says, if he was sold, that's not to explain why the word who is in the pasuk. But rather to get to the real question Rashi wants to ask is, how did the children become slaves? So either way you look at it, this doesn't make sense. Either here it doesn't make sense, or in Mishpatim it doesn't make sense. If we've got this question, how did the children become slaves? And the only way to address that question is by asking, if he was a slave, who sold them? Then the same logic dictates that in Pashas Mishpatim, Rashi should have launched his pirush the same way. If he is sold, who sold his wife? And if we don't need that introduction in order to ask the question, how did they become slaves? Which is would be the reason why in Pashas Mishpatim, before discussing the wife's status, Rashi doesn't first say, if he was sold. Then why do we need it here? Muslims sagen, that's going to force us to appreciate it's not the words of the two psukim, Mishpatim versus Behar, that are different. Rather, it is the message and content of Behar and Mishpatim that are different. That's what Rashi is showing us. That will help us to understand which would explain why in Parshas Mishpatim Rashi doesn't go to the Gemara Kiddushin, it doesn't quote Rabbi Shimon, instead he uses the Mechilta. Whereas in our Parsha he needs the words of Rabbi Shimon because they are more suited to the message of our Parsha. Secondly, and will also explain why here Rashi has to tell us who is speaking. Rabbi Shimon. Whereas in Parshas Mishpatim, where Rashi is quoting the Mechilta, he doesn't tell us who the Tana speaking is, which happens to be Rabbi Yitzchak. Now, before we get there, at least we have really important information, which is that the message and content of Parshas Mishpatim and Parshas Behar are different. There's something else we need to ask about Rashi before we can start putting the pieces together. In Ditzvei Pirushei Rashi, there's something else which is strange about the two commentaries of Rashi in Mishpatim and Behar. In Parshas Mishpatim, sagt Rashi, When it's in Parshas Mishpatim, Rashi teaches us, already in Parshas Mishpatim, he's telling us that the master is not only required to provide food for the wife, but for the children as well. So now we know that information before we get to Parshas Behar. And the interesting thing is Rashi is saying this even though there's no mention of children in the pasuk. So therefore the Mefarshim say, well, Rashi is telling us that factually the owner, the master has to provide food for the children, but it's actually not derived from this pasuk because this pasuk doesn't speak about children. Because as mentioned, this pasuk is only speaking about the yotza ishtoi, that his wife leaves with him. So we can't extrapolate automatically from the fact that the wife had to be catered for by the master that the children do too. That's as the Gemara says. And even logically, you could say, look, we understand why the Torah is protecting the wife, because it's embarrassing for a woman to go knocking on doors asking for a handout. Therefore the master has to step in. But you wouldn't apply the same logic to the children, for you know the children might be old enough to go and raise funds for themselves. Rather than the Mefarshim are telling us, seeing as Rashi is already telling us at that point in time that the master has to supply food to the wife, so while we're about it, Rashi also alerts us to the fact that the same rule is going to apply to the children, even though we're not going to learn from this pasuk. And Rashi knows this information because he already knows what's coming in our parasha and Parashas Behar. So he's giving us the info without giving us the source at that particular point in time. And actually that's what the Mechilta does. That the master is responsible to feed the wife and the children. Shenemar, which pasuk? Ours. Our parasha. But that appears it's tzarchi and gadol, but that's also leaving us with big questions. The logic is that if in Parshas Mishpatim, while he's telling us the mitzvah of supplying food for the wife, he's also derech hagav telling us about the children, then the reverse should also work. Over here in our parasha, where he's talking about the children, he should remind us parenthetically that the same applies to the wife. That's actually how the Teras Kahanim says it in our parasha. But besides that, is Madachas the Mechilta Dafop Taichem Beferish as Mazenis Bonav Lentman up Funon and under Pasuk. We get it. The Mechilta clearly tells us that the requirement to provide food for the children is not learnt in Parshas Mishpatim, but rather from Parshas Behar. Rashi should have done the same. Rashi, whose job is to give us the pshat, and is addressing a young child, surely should have alerted us in Parshas Mishpatim that the information that you also have to provide food to the children is coming from a later pasuk, which we haven't yet learned. So therefore we actually have to conclude, if you're looking through Rashi's lens, which is the pshat of the psukim, there is actually good reason to believe that if a person is required to provide food for the slave's wife, it must also logically apply to the children as well. Well, if in Parashas Mishpatim, Rashi is presenting us with a logical conclusion that if you have to provide for the wife, you have to provide for the children, why do we need a pasuk then, all the way in Parashas Behar, to tell us what we've already worked out logically? That question is also magnified. Rashi is look at Rashi's language in our pasuk, where he says specifically Elomikan. Here is the source for the fact that the master has to supply food to the children. And that's different to Parshas Mishpatim, where he just said, the pasuk is telling us. Here he's saying, Mikan, this is the source. Rashi is madgish, as the limit is Mikan dafko nit voneinander ort. Rashi is obviously highlighting for us that the way we know that a master has to supply food for the children of his Eved is from this pasuk specifically. Now we have two Rashis that contradict each other, because in Parshas Mishpatim, Rashi is implying that you know logically from the fact that the master has to look after the wife, that he also has to look after the children, versus this Rashi which is saying, oh, we only get this information now from the pasuk, not from logic. Which one is it? The last piece of the puzzle is going to depend on something we should have picked up about the language that Rashi uses, which does not seem to flow, does not seem to align. Rashi starts his commentary by saying, if he, the Eved, was sold. That's passive language. And then when he describes the children, he says, who sells the children? That's active language. Why the switch? That's incongruous. It shouldn't work that way. Normally you use either both passive form or both active form. But Rashi should have done that. Right? It should have said, if he was sold, were the children sold? Or he could have said, if he sold himself, who sold his children? Der Pele is in them is not Kresser, and what makes that even more astounding is in Gemara the Gemara does keep it consistent by using the passive voice for both the slave and the children. Rashi is meshane from the Lashon and Zak Banim Mecharan, and Rashi, who's ostensibly quoting the Gemara, quoting Rabbi Shimon in the Gemara, changes the language. Why would he do that? That is the linchpin to understanding what's going on over here. The Bir Bazeh. The halacha is that a father does not have the jurisdiction to sell his underage son into slavery, although he could his daughter. From Pasuk, because the Pasuk tells us again in Parshas Mishpatim, that a man sells his daughter to become an Amma Ivriya. From that, the Gemara learns how Ish Moicher as Bitoi, Ve'enoi Moicher as Benoi. A father has the authority to sell his daughter as a maid, not the authority to sell his son as a slave. And therefore, the Gemara's question is, he could be sold as an adult. His sons, how could they be sold? See, then, it's a broad question. Is it even possible for children, boys, to be sold into slavery? That is, if you're looking through halacha. But Rashi is looking according to the pshat of the pasuk. From pasuk when the parasha of Mishpatim tells us that a man sells his daughter as a slave, there's nothing in pshat that says that means his daughter and specifically not his son. The only reason it's saying daughter there is because that was the context. That is the section in Torah that's talking about the laws, and there are unique laws for a girl who becomes an Amma Ivriya in terms of marriage, etc. And the first bitoy. And so the Pshat would say that's why we're talking about a daughter, because that happens to be the focus of that particular conversation. But there's nothing in Pshat that says it is impossible for a boy to be sold by his father as a slave. We have no evidence in the pshat of the pasuk to distinguish between a child that is male and female. There's nothing to tell us you can only sell your daughter, not your son. That's why Rashi uses different language to what the Gemara uses. His question is not, could they be sold? Because they could, according to pshat. No, his question is, who sold them? The shaila is not mimecharon. It's possible, it's viable, it's legal, according to Pshat. The question is, who sold these children? Now that we know that Rashi has made that observation, that the question over here is not whether it is legal for boys to be sold by their fathers into slavery, but rather the technical question of who sold them, that the master should have to release them, that's going to start to put together the picture of what's going on over here. The first thing it helps us to understand is why Rashi begins. It doesn't go straight to the question of why are these sons considered slaves, how did they become slaves, but he first says, imhu nimkar. If the man, the Eved, the father was sold, who sold the children? Because what's bothering Rashi in this pasuk is not only the boys, how did boys become slaves? Now, who? He's bothered by the apparently extra word who, which doesn't need to be in that pasuk. But as far as into Dibur HaMaschil, and the way you know that Rashi is bothered by that word is because he includes it in the headline of this particular commentary. The Lechera, is there word hu in Pasuk Iberik? Because at face value, that word hu does not need to be in the Pasuk. It already says he leaves the master. In other words, he is going free. So we already know we're talking about the Eved himself. Then just tack onto that his sons. Who needs to add again, he goes free? You just told me he goes free. Voltlinke can't learn, so you might have learned. You might have learned like this. Look, this is a particular scenario where the person is destitute and therefore has sold themselves, volunteered themselves to become a slave. So made the Torah mitu of one of imot zayin zwei metziasen. So now the fact that the Torah says here's somebody who's destitute and sold themselves as a slave, that could happen in two possible ways. It could be he is a slave and now he gets released in Yovel. So that must be addressing the scenario where he sold himself as a slave, and that's where it began and ended. And so now in the 50th year he goes free. Then the next part of the pasuk, on hu ubanav imo, is not repeating this information we already know. It's introducing a new scenario. This is a person who is so financially desperate. This is somebody who's in such a horrific state that not only does he sell himself into slavery, but he sells his family as well. And it's addressing that second scenario that the Torah tells us, that when it comes to the 50th year, then two things could happen. Either he, if he's the only slave, goes free, or he and his children go free. And not them, Pirish is Rashi Sholel. So you might have understood it that way. That's why Rashi has to clarify for us, no, who belongs to this one scenario of a person and his children. So what does he say? Im hu nimkar, the fact that he was sold bishlomo hu, steht im Pasuk wegen im beferish v'nimkalach. Okay, we understand how he becomes a slave because the Torah tells us, Ki a person becomes destitute v'nimkalach, and he sells himself, or he is sold to you. But where's there any evidence in the pasuk that the children were sold as well? So therefore, why would the Torah be describing their release if the Torah never described their becoming slaves in the first place? And that's different to Parashas Mishpatim. Mashenkin in Parashas Mishpatim where in Parashas Mishpatim where it says that his wife leaves with him on dem word who, and it doesn't use the word who. Rashi doesn't have to raise this question of im hu nimkar. If he was sold, how did his wife get sold? It's not an issue. Because Rashi says, according to the Pshat, there is no evidence that these children ever became slaves, there must be another meaning to the fact that they are now released from the master, released from his responsibilities to provide for them. In that expression, he and his children go, that doesn't mean they go free, because they were never slaves. But rather, rather here the Torah is describing that they are now released from the custody or responsibility of the master, who, as long as he had this Eved, was supposed to supply food for the children as well. It's to that extent that the children were part of his reality as an Eved that they had to be supported by the Adon. As in dem Chir Vazenis von unser Pasuk is da Chidesh Eichel Gabe dem Eved Gufa Kidel Kam on Sif Zayin. Plus, we're about to discover, not yet, in 2 paragraphs' time, that actually the fact that the master has to supply food for the Eved is something not to be taken for granted. Zok the Pasuk Nitna Bonov Imoy dem Chir Vazenis Bonov. So therefore the Torah, because it's now talking about supplying food, the first innovation is he's got to supply food for the children. So he tells us, but then he adds, not hu, but the Torah adds that also who, that you might have thought the master is not responsible to provide food to the Eved himself, therefore it says who. Before we get there, the fact that there's a fundamentally different context to the Parashas Mishpatim version of the slave and this one, Rashi already told us in Parashas Mishpatim. As the Parasha von Eved Ivri dort red wegen ein Eved was machru besdim begnei vasai. Rashi tells us there that Parashas Mishpatim is the description of a person who stole something, could not afford the reparations that the Torah requires. Therefore, the Beis Din steps in and sells him into slavery to work back his debt. Mashenke the Parashas Eved Ivri in unser Sedra, Whereas our parasha, Behar, Rashi says that's talking about a person who chose to sell themselves as a slave because of their financial distress. And that's clear in the pasuk because it says, if your brother will be destitute and therefore sell himself. That means these are two completely different scenarios. Davon kommt heraus a Chelek in dem Geder Achiv von dem Adam zu geben seines Lichtsteuerwohnen von dem Eved. And there are two completely different considerations in terms of the master having to look after the family of the Eved. Wenn einer verkauft durch Besten sheloi beretzonoi. If a person is sold into slavery unwillingly because he has a debt to pay, it's logical to say, as Bezdin is going to be responsible. And so obviously if they're putting him into a situation where he has to be an Eved, they're also going to worry that his family should be cared for. Das heißt, which means in that scenario, the fact that the master has to look after the family and provide food for them, is nicht so lieb, that the Eles, was der Oden hat durch der, was Eved is leben dem Eved. It's not because he's getting any benefits from this. Well, now the Eved has his wife, so maybe he'll be happier, more productive. And maybe there's certain responsibilities that he doesn't have to worry about because the wife is there and she'll provide all of these things. That's not the reason he's looking after her. No, it's because the Beis Din is required to ensure that he does so. Because usually a man is supposed to provide for his wife, and here this man cannot, therefore the Beis Din has to take responsibility and ensure that she is provided for. Therefore the Beis Din is going to make a deal with the master that if you're taking on this Eved, you're taking on the family, or at least the wife as well. Okay, so now you can see where Rashi gets the logical conclusion that if you have to supply the wife with what she needs, you have to supply the children as well. If the Beis Din is concerned that the Adon should provide food for the wife, who technically could go get a job and earn, then for sure the Beis Din has to look out for his little children, who are not at the age and stage where they can go and earn independently. Therefore, Rashi says it's obviously logical, and I don't have to bring a proof for it. It just makes sense that in the scenario where Beis Din is facilitating the sale of this Eved, naturally they take care not only of the wife but of the children as well. That's not the same scenario in our parasha. In our parasha, where we're talking about a person who opts to sell himself because of his destitute situation, this is a mutual agreement between him and his Adon. It's got nothing to do with the Beis Din. Hot Beis Din nicht was submission sich. So there's no reason for Beis Din to get involved, which means Mechayev sein dem Odin to give him There's no reason for the Beis Din to now impose on this person, oh, by the way, you also have to supply food for his family. And if the Odin is the Shaykh and Chiv to Mefar sein Mashpacha so Eved, and it doesn't make sense that the Odin should have to take on the load of the family. Unless that was the deal. They have no connection. So why should he have to now take the responsibility to feed them? So we would have thought, you would think that if a person is selling himself into slavery, he still carries the responsibility to feed his family. Or maybe they have to be like all the other poor people in town. So therefore the Torah comes along to say, this is the Chiddush. Despite the fact that logically you would have assumed that the master is exempt from providing food to the children, guess what? He is actually required. The Torah introduces a halacha you would never have anticipated, as that even in a scenario where the person sold themselves into slavery, the master is required to provide for the children. The truth is, it goes even one step further. It's not only a surprise that the master has to supply food for the children, it's even surprising he has to supply food for this man. Damit wird man euch verstehen, was der Pasuk ist madgish, right? Was the Torah emphasized not just that he is now released, that the children are released from the responsibility of the Adon, but he is too. Weil in dem Fall von Mecher Atzmoi is echt das, was der Eved bekommt, Mazonos for Rabbi Achidish. Because if a man is out of desperation, selling himself into slavery, it's actually a surprise to us that his master now has to supply his food. You could logically argue, as the Adon is nicht mechuyev zu geben dem Eved kein Mazonos, that the deal is not, or it's not an automatic responsibility on the Adon to supply food to the slave. They made an agreement, you're going to work X, you're going to be paid X. Now the Torah is saying, and over and above that, you're going to give him food. That wasn't the agreement. And you could even argue that the master would be well within his rights to give him the bare minimum of food and water, that he should be able to have enough energy to work. But not married, doesn't have to give anything more than that. Therefore the Torah makes sure that we are clear who that the responsibility of the master is to supply food, not just basics, but the normal food that this person would ordinarily have eaten. That's the Chiddush. And then the Chiddush goes beyond that, and for his children. And now it's clear why in this pasuk Rashi does not include the wife, even though he included the children in explaining the responsibilities of the Adon in Pashas Mishpatim. Because there's nothing in this pasuk that addresses the wife. And if, like in Pashas Mishpatim, where the svara was, well, if you have to look after the wife, logically you have to look after the children. Here, if you're saying you have to look after the children, the logic doesn't necessarily include the wife. If we're talking about a person who sold himself in desperation, there's no automatic logical link that because the master has to look after the children, he has to look after the wife. You could argue that maybe the reason the Torah is imposing this responsibility on the Adon to look after the children is you could just say because the Torah feels bad for these children. They do not have the capacity to support themselves. So the logic would say, but the wife can. She can go out. She can also sew dresses or get a job or whatever it is. There's another logical process that we could follow. Is Rabbi the exact opposite side, which is Rashi has already established from Pashas Mishpatim that the master is responsible to provide for the servant, and that naturally means his wife as well. Because as mentioned, he actually benefits from the fact that the family is a unit, because that way she can take some of the responsibilities that he doesn't have to worry about for the slave, because the wife will take care of it. So maybe it's just natural that we know automatically that he has to supply for the wife, and Rashi doesn't have to tell us. Either way, whatever logical conclusion we're going to arrive at, it's not going to be derived from because he's supplying the children with food, therefore he has to supply the wife. Because it's clear that having children in the home does not benefit the master. And that's why he's not naturally going to want to commit himself to look after them. But it's something which is you got to kind of work it out. How, as mentioned, there's two ways that you can look at it. How do you treat the wife? So either your logic is going to go down the route, well, look, if the Beis Din sold him into slavery, we know that we have to take into consideration the wife. Let's compare that over here. Same thing over here. In the case where the Beis Din said you've got to look after the wife because she's going to provide certain services to the husband, same thing would apply here. And you cannot expect her to look after herself. But the point is, you're not going to learn it out of the words bonav, and therefore Rashi does not bring it into his commentary. Now, the student who's really on the game is going to ask as follows. Okay, so you're telling me that the Torah mandates that the master has to supply food for the children. The question is why? The master has nothing to do with these kids. Only can tell us funze, and he gets no benefit from these children. Was is schuldig as the Obat sich verkauft zu ihm als Eved? What's his problem? This man, as a thinking adult, chose to sell himself as an Eved. As soll sein müssen besorgen. Because of that, the master has to take on the load of the children. We should treat them like we treat any other poor people. Community coffers, as you would for any underage indigent person. Rashi alludes to why it is that a responsibility to the father naturally translates into a responsibility to the child, because who's speaking? Rabbi Shimon, was the Shitose ist das verstandig. When you know how Rabbi Shimon thinks about this kind of child-father relationship, you understand exactly why he would say this. Rabbi sagt in Masechta Baba Basra, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that if a person does not leave a child to inherit him, the Eibush is angry at such a person. Rashi is verstandig. If you understand what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying over here, it's not that the Eibush is angry at a person for not having children. Now, he says specifically a child who is suitable to inherit. If a person brings up a child who is suitable to inherit their role, their position, that gives the Eibush a simcha. Right? So if that creates simcha for the Eibush, if a father does not leave a child who is in that position, who is going to, so to speak, continue his legacy, that is kavayocha what angers the Eibush. Leit Rashbi is that Goshen Kinda soll sein ben leyorsha kom tachasoviv. So Rashbi is telling us over here, the whole purpose of a child is to continue what you stand for. Because a father and a son is a single continuum. You could even say more than that, a single entity. If they're a single entity, then it makes sense that the person who takes on the Eved is required to look after his children too. Not because of his responsibilities, but because of their relationship with their father. Naturally, because he is required to look after the father and supply him with proper food. Well, part of being a father is having children. So if you have a responsibility to nourish the father, you naturally have a responsibility to nourish the part of the father that became the child. And by the way, that explains where the pasuk goes thereafter. When it says that the Eved is freed in Yovel, where does he go? The pasuk says, he goes back to the territory of his ancestors. The father is one entity with his children, as he is one entity with his ancestors. So that's where he's got to go back. And that also gives us beautiful insight into why Rashi's explanation, according to Pshat, of that expression is El Kevoid Avoisav. He goes back to the honor of his family. In the same way as you cannot separate the Eved from his children, so we cannot detach this Eved from his ancestors. And therefore, where does he go straight back to? To where he came from. To the honor of his family, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, by maintaining their legacy, by being an heir to what that family is all about. From this we get an incredible insight, based on Rashi's interpretation, to how Golus works. The Indian from Eved is Golus, being sold as a slave, is metaphoric of being in Golus. Zog the pasuk, therefore the pasuk tells us, Asai de ov on sai bonov, whether you're looking from the perspective of the father, the Eved, or his children, which represents sai kvayochol avinu shebashamayim and sai eden v'zayim bodem lamokim, which translates into the Eibush as our father and we as his children. Zayin and Avek in Golus are in Golus together. The same Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai teaches us wherever the Yidden land up in Golus, the Shechina is there too. If then bringt Rabbi Shimon was halt noch aggression uftu. So it's already an incredible message to us that the Eibishter is with us in the most difficult of times in every Golus. Says Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, as Rashi quotes over here, more than that. Not only is it that wherever we go into Golus, the Eibishter's divine presence is with us. No adarabah. But look how Rashi says it. Im hu nimkar. If he was sold. Bonav mi mecharon bitmiyah. Who sold the children? What does that mean? What Rashi is alluding to is that the Eibishter who can do anything can submit himself to the Golus. Weil ist akal yochol, auf Mele kann sich hereinstellen in Golus und zusammen damit nicht standen werden durch Golus, because the Eibishter is beyond time, space, beyond any parameters, any requirements. So the Eibishter can put himself in Golus without the Golus having any impact. Aber bonov mi mecharon. But how could the children go into Golus? How could you put the Yidden into Golus? If Golus hat a Shlita, if Hayidden, kann doch bei ihm nicht stehen bei Golus, als er ben HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If you're putting a Jew into Golus, and the Golus impacts the Jew, then how do you see it's bonov? How do you see that connection to the Eibishter? And for Rabbi, so to that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai answers, as das was born of sein in Golus is as mernit vizera und legabe zera mezonos. You know which part of the child is in Golus? The child's not in Golus. The responsibility to feed the child, the food, the nourishment of the child is in Golus. Tzorchei haguf, our material experiences and needs, that is what is locked into the Golus. They have to be distributed. The food has to be distributed to us by the so-called master of the country, the so-called spiritual agent that is responsible to get Hashem's brachas to us. Aber die Neshama von Eiden ist nicht verkauft geworden in Golus Chas v'Shalom. But the Neshama can never go into Golus. Like the Pasuk never said that the children were actually slaves. It's just that they're fed via their master. Like the famous saying, nor unser Gufim seine übergegeben in Golus, the Friedrich Rebbe says, only our bodies were handed over into the Golus. Aber unsere Neshamas hat man in Golus nicht vertrieben und in Shiv Malchus nicht übergegeben, but our Neshamas were never shackled into the Golus and never handed over into the Golus. Das was again a Churban, the fact that there was a destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. So das when again the Gashmas from Beis HaMikdash Eitzim v'Avonim means the physical structure of the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. Was hat man gegeben a Goy Shlita. The Eibishter allowed nations of the world to have power over the structure, the physical building. Aber if the Mitzvah Beis HaMikdash aruchni. But the real Beis HaMikdash, which is spiritual, and of course that reflects the internal Beis HaMikdash where the Eibishter resides within ourselves. The Beis HaMikdash was his do by Yedi Eden. A Goy can Shlita nit. There's no power in the world, no nation in the world that can overcome our internal spiritual connection to the Eibishter. In dem se Shaykh and Korban can never be destroyed. So then you'll think, okay, fine. So at least the mezonos, our physical needs, in that area, the Golus does affect us, and we might be limited in terms of what we get. So, unless we behave the way that the non-Jews expect of us. So therefore Rabbi Shimon tells us, the Torah is telling us that the master is required to give us what we need. The structure that the Eibishter created for Golus is only that the way our brachas reach us is via those spiritual structures that the Eibishter made, which include the nations of the world. But the Sarah Medina, the nation that we're living under, doesn't have a choice whether or not to supply our brachas. Chayev! It's like an axe in the hand of the chopper. He doesn't have an opinion. Or Nochmer, not only is he not capable of choosing to withhold from us, as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is telling us that the Sarah Medina, the so-called governmental representation, is required to provide for us what we need. And therefore, even in Golus, we're supposed to have an abundance of all the brachas we need in the major areas of life, in health, in family, in sustenance, and all of them in the most generous and extravagant way. And in Mitzvah Hashem, we shouldn't have to even live with that wealth for too long, because we should have Mashiach, and that obviously as the pasuk says, "V'yatzo hu ve'imoy, hu bon avimoy," that we'll all go out of Golus. Should happen. Take it from Yad Mamish.